Who wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles?
Lots of different people, and we don't know their names. But I like to think about, I was thinking the title of my book, who made the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, because it's a making activity more than a writing. I mean, writing's obviously involved, and you have to think about the different phases within which the chronicle was made. The first phase is the reign of King Alfred, probably the late ninth century. Um, I argue in my recent book that there's an early phase and a later phase. Two distinct authors are very clear, and they're very clear voices linguistically, and different interests that come across in that. And the first phase of the annals and the making of the annals may bring the annals only to the mid 860s. It's not clear. That author may have been working later. Alfred comes to the throne in 871, so he may have been working early in the reign of Alfred, but he may have been writing uh, even earlier. He might have started making the chronicles in the reign of Athelwulf. Probably no earlier than that, though. Um, One thing that's very important in that early phase and gives you a sense of when they're being made, it's the importance of Alfred's royal line, which sort of as kings of Wessex is descended from a very much earlier king of Wessex, but he well, yeah, much earlier. But Alfred's grandfather Egbert features prominently in the chronicles from the late 8th century and into the ninth century up into the 830s when he dies. And then King Athelwulf features, and then Alfred's brothers get a bit of a mention, and then Alfred features. So is this a chronicler of the reign of Athelwulf talking up his father and talking him up? Um, or is it a chronicler of the reign of Alfred talking up all three? His brothers don't get such, I mean, they're mentioned and the events of their lives are mentioned. Sometimes the events of their lives are glossed over. Um, Alfred's brother Athelbald rebelled against their father when Ethelwulf had been off visiting Rome, away for a year, coming back through Carolingian Empire, marrying Judith, the daughter of the emperor. He arrived back in England, and his son Ethelbald said, "Well, actually, I've been king for a little while now, and I'm going to stay king because I like being king." We know this story because Asser, in his Life of Alfred, tells us, but it's not in the Chronicle. So the most amazing thing for me is that omission from the Chronicle, which must be telling us something about the ideology of whoever made the annals around that time, that they preferred to smooth out this difficulty that was experienced in the royal house of Wessex. So Athelwulf was left just with what's called the eastern part of the kingdom, which would have been Kent, Surrey perhaps, and his son Athelbald reigned in the heartland of Wessex. Uh, After the death of Athelwulf, Athelbald becomes king. So the brothers, their treatment, not so well. He is being glossed over. So, I mean, is this a chronicler, the first chronicler writing during the reign of Athelbald becomes a question, because he's leaving out this major event, which puts Athelbald in a very bad light. He also took his father's widow as his bride, which is against canon law, and was considered very unseemly, all unmentioned in the chronicle. So for me, there are hints that the first phase of the chronicle writing is there in the 860s, early 860s. But then it gets the thorough rewriting and going over and revision sometime in the 880s, when we have this chronicler who fully buys into Alfred as the great king, as the restorer of the fortunes of Wessex and of England, a unified monarchy, no sense of dual kings or sharing kingship. The monarchies of all the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had survived up until sort of the mid ninth century, so in Northumbria, in East Anglia and Mercia, have all gone. The Vikings have removed the Anglo-Saxon monarchies. There are Viking monarchies in Northumbria and East Anglia, but that's it. So Alfred is claiming to be king, and this chronicler um, buys into this and writes a history and revises parts of the chronicle, probably going back into the 8th century, but no further, that really glorify the House of Wessex um, as the new sort of, with its claim to rule the Anglo-Saxons. This is a claim that's made not just in the chronicle, but beyond it in certain documents. Alfred is king of the Anglo-Saxons, Rex Anglo-Saxonum, which starts to take on an ethnic character rather than just geographic. He seems to be claiming some sort of jurisdiction, not jurisdiction, but symbolic kingship of people who are under the Vikings and their rule at the time. Beyond
Right.
that, of course, beyond that, the chronicle is then extended. So who wrote the chronicle? Well, not all chronicles are extended. Some chronicles are written and nobody touches them. And the end date tells you exactly when they were made. But the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, they become plural in the 890s. And across the course of the 10th century, there are many continuations. The 7 manuscripts that survived into the modern period seem to be the tip of an iceberg. They're probably, well, funny sort of iceberg, dozens more would have been circulating and being produced in the Anglo-Saxon period. Major churches, cathedrals, where there were communities with the technology of writing and interest in reading history, would have had copies. And so the major uplift in the chronicle after Alfred, that's continued in the reign of his son Edward the Elder, and the Mercian version into Mercia, where his Athelflaed, his daughter, is in charge with her husband. Then the chronicle dies a bit, and there's this major interest in history and historical writing in Winchester in the mid-10th century, and the chronicle gains in real impetus. Then it sort of peters out again. There's a bit of interest in Abingdon, it seems. But then there's a major interest in the chronicle at the beginning of the 11th century in the wake of Canute's and his father Sweyn's conquest of England, when the annals of the reign of Ethelred the Unready really try to come to terms with the fact that something has radically changed. We're ruled by a foreign king, a Dane. The chronicle, there's an awareness of this author that the chronicle was first produced when King Alfred actually resisted the Danish invasion of England. 100 years later, there was a successful one. And this writer of the Annals of Ethelred also seems to be associated with the Northern Recension, which is a major revision of the chronicle. Downplays the role of Alfred, downplays the role of Wessex. So it's a new national chronicle for a new political situation. And then the chronicle is continued in various places, not during the reign of Canute. People go very quiet during the reign of Canute. But then from the 1040s, with the return of the line of Wessex, with the accession of Edward the Confessor, there's great interest in historical writing, coming to terms with difficult moments in history and contests for power. And then post-conquest with William, the chronicle continues as people wrestle with that next wave of conquest. What does it mean to be English? What does it mean? They're very Christian people. What does it mean that God has punished us with these invasions and these particularly cruel kings? And then continues into the 12th century. The only continuation we have, there would have been others, is the one that was made in Peterborough Abbey in just north of London. Peterborough is very important abbey. It becomes very interested in local affairs, but still a national chronicle. But there's a lot of stuff about Peterborough in it. Its last major events that it reports on in the 1140s of the Civil War, the contest for the throne between Stephen and Matilda. And it's almost like the chronicle ends with exhaustion after that's all finished. Henry II comes to the throne and the chronicle stops. Yeah.
Right. So it seems like the picture that I get is that the Chronicle sort of gets renewed every once in a while, where someone decides to make a new edition with a bunch more entries. Is that kind of an accurate sort of depiction of the way that it's produced?
Certainly, yeah. And it's periodic, but it does coincide with times of crisis, because these are annals about kings. So sometimes crisis, sometimes consolidation. So with Alfred, it's consolidation and crisis. The reigns of Edward the Elder and Athelflaed, they're reconquering territory from the Vikings. The reign of Athelstan, it sort of dies a bit, but then looking back, probably at Winchester in the 950s to the reign of Athelstan, that's when you get the Battle of Brunanburh inserted into the chronicle. There's an awareness that England has changed. We now have a monarchy, one monarchy for sort of the whole of England, and beyond that to the submission of the British kings. And that seems to have sparked the interest of somebody who was into history at Winchester. We have a copy of Bede's, the Old English version of Bede's History made at Winchester at the same time. So there's indication of wider historical interest. And then, as I said, with the reign of Ethelred, this national crisis, it's people using the annals as a continuing story, as a way of reflecting on what's going on in the longue durée. Yeah. So, what is the story of this nation, country, people? And they use the chronicle. They add to the chronicle, these new authors, but they're clearly looking back to earlier annals and reflecting on the whole story, which makes it quite interesting. It's a very interesting dimension. So they're not just blogging; they're revising, rewriting, and reflecting on an ongoing story. Yeah, sometimes
And
very difficult
then,
story to make sense with. Yeah,
right. And then you use the term exhausted, which I kind of like, but then you get the sense that in the 12th century, middle of 12th century, there's just there's no attempt to continue it. It seems we've come to the end of a line of people who stop renewing it, essentially.
it, there's multiple factors. By the middle of the 12th century, English is changing very quickly as a language. Um, so even though the Chronicles language is updated, sort of the earlier entries are updated slightly. The later entries are what you'd have to call Proto-Middle English. They're transitional Old English into Middle English. And so beyond that moment, reading the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles becomes difficult, actually reading the language of them. And the Chronicles are used as sources by these great Anglo-Norman historians like William of Malmesbury, Henry of Huntingdon, John of Worcester, and others. And it's their use of the Chronicles into their Latin histories that then feeds later historical writing, because people can read the Latin, but they can't read the Old English. But I also think, as a form, as historical form, the Chronicles, it's breaking down in the 1140s. So with that last author of the Chronicles, he doesn't do it in an analytic way. He describes events across many years in one annal, because analytic history isn't so good at telling stories. So that author of the annals of the reign of Ethelred the Unready, at the sort of from the 980s up to 1014, 1016, is he does that. He writes a continuous story. I think it's he. Maybe it's a team of he's with somebody who's a guiding intelligence, but probably revising earlier annals and embedding them in a longer story. But the development of historiography in the 12th century would make the Anglo-Saxon chronicles look a bit, I don't know, unhelpful. Admer of Canterbury, writing his sort of history of recent events, seems to be complaining that he can't find anything that provides a history that explains things. He can find similarly, he knows the annals, we know he knows the annals. They're very descriptive in many ways, but they don't help you to understand what's going on. So this new style of writing history emerges in the late 11th century. So the annalist of the reign of William I, William the Conqueror, goes into great detail in the annal for 1087, describing the death of William. But he talks about his personality. He says, I was at court, I observed him. So he inserts himself. So he's not that detached analyst. He's an observer of history, a witness of history, and paints a very grim picture of William as a personality. He was a very violent man. He was a very greedy man. But at the same time, he's very authoritative, because this author's looking back from the reign of William II, Rufus, which is very anarchic. So under William I, there was a strong king. He likes the strong king. But yes, he sort of says if he'd put as much effort into being a good man as he did into running things the way he wanted to, then things would have been a lot better. But it's that close, detailed analysis and sort of a more you get the more sense of individual portraits, which the Chronicle gives us. The early Chronicle gives us nothing of. The
Yeah,
annals of the Ethelred the Unready don't even talk about him, really.
it's the stulus humilis that you talk about, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Which
Yes.
we'll talk about more later, but that does seem to be kind of what changes then, and what perhaps the historiographers you're talking about would have been maybe frustrated with.
I think so. Very helpful. I mean, the Chronicle seems to emerge out of Bede's history, in terms of its composition. So Bede wrote this great ecclesiastical history in 5 books, very detailed, lots of exploration of personality, cause and effect in history, why this happened, why that happened. very comprehensive, particularly for the north of England where Bede was. And at the end of it, he includes what we call the epitome, which is a summary of events. Um, so it's funny, some of the events he picks and some doesn't, but a major concern of Bede in this historical summary at the end is to provide lots of those little annals have dating systems overlapping. 15th year of this king in the year of our Lord. So he's almost looking forward to future historians because they have great trouble establishing the dates of events. Um, and so the chronicle is still useful to the 12th century historians because it gives them dates. And where the dates are wrong, they can correct them because they have multiple sources. But it's, I mean, if you get back to the etymology of chronicle, we don't know what they called the chronicle, but chronology is very important to a chronicle. Establishing when things happened dominates almost over what happened, which is, it's interesting.
Yeah. So speaking of dates and chronology, one of the first, I think, kind of problems that you really tackle in your book is that from the middle of the 8th century to the middle of the ninth, there's this, you say, I think you say it's seriously wrong. There's something seriously wrong with the chronology of the Old English annals. So all
Yeah.
of our manuscripts have a 2 to 3 year dislocation. How do
Mm.
we fix this? How do we tackle this problem?
Well, the first thing is to detect it,
Hmm.
which it was long detected because it reports some events from continental history, this great battle in the Carolingian Empire, which is out by 2 years. So already you know there's a problem. And then certain dates of kings don't match across that period. Certain dates of bishops and archbishops don't match, which are recorded in other places as well. So when somebody became Archbishop of Canterbury, say, but that's the main sort of thing we find reported in that section. So first of all, you establish that there's a chronological problem, and so it starts with annal. The number that's given to the annal is number 755 in the Chronicles, but that should be annal 757. So it's 2 years out. It's 2 years early. And around 830, that becomes a 3-year dislocation, which we can tell by the dates of certain events. And it seems to correct itself maybe in the late 840s, but certainly by the beginning of the annals of the 850s. So it's about a century of annals are dislocated. And so one of the things I try to do in my book, in one of the chapters, is find a new way of approaching this question. And the major sources of the chronicle, as I've mentioned, Bede's epitome is established. All all the entries from Bede's epitome basically get into the chronicle, so it's clear that this is a source. Um, Regnal lists, charters, events from the lives of kings, and so I think there's been an assumption in chronicle study since the 1890s with Plummer's fantastic edition that they began with regnal lengths to establish their chronology. But this seems to me to be absurd. If you've got Bede's chronology in there and they're writing a chronicle, that they would start with Bede, who gives them very reliable dates for everything that he covers up to the 730s. Um, and I should add that Bede's epitome is extended in some manuscripts. People keep that chronicle going. So there's this impulse to maintaining a chronological or chronicle record. But if you think about this, this means that in the 730s, up to the 730s, the maker of the chronicle, working either in the 860s or the 880s, whenever it was, has a really reliable record of when things actually happened. Can trust Bede. After that, what are you using as your chronological spine to extend it up to your present? Um, across a period where there were no great historians in England, there was nobody writing history in that way that Bede had. And so you're the next one after Bede who's doing this, and you've got to think, well, how am I going to establish this chronology? And what you do is you find some reliable document which tells you a chronology. So I think the chronicle for that century, most of it, originally had a reliable chronology which was later messed up by somebody who intervened. You see my two author theory comes in here. So I think, and I argue in the book, that what was used was a record of the archbishops of Canterbury. Because at Canterbury, they would have kept a clear record of when archbishops died and when a new archbishop was consecrated, when he received his pallium from Rome, from the Pope. And this is what you find across that centuries. The most clearly datable events are all related to the archbishops of Canterbury or to Canterbury itself. And then using that, the problem is that the Archbishop of Canterbury from 831? Kelred, I think it's Kelred, no, Kelnoth, um, lives a really long time. So you don't get from about the 830s, you don't get sort of, and he died, and then he got the pallium, then he died, and then he was buried. So this real gap emerges then. So the other thing about the early 830s is that there seems to have been an argument over who's going to be Archbishop of Canterbury. There were rival claimants. Normally, the Archbishop would have been elected by the monks, because he was also the leader of their community, the monastic community at Christ Church at Canterbury. But there would have been rival claimants supported by kings, that sort of thing. The 830s is also a time of shifting power in Kent, where Canterbury is obviously located. The West Saxons are now the power in the land. The Mercians had been. The Mercian power is waning. So in somewhere in sort of that mix, there's probably rival claimants as well. People, maybe Mercians trying to re-establish their authority in Canterbury, or maybe Mercians in Canterbury trying to resist the authority of Wessex. But there's something going on. And so there's a year of three archbishops. And the Chronicle is very confused when it's reporting this. And it's quite possible that the records reporting this were also confused, including perhaps erasure. If they were formatted against what we call Easter tables with very little space each year to record what happened, it might have been confusing about the order of events. And this is where we find the 2-year chronological error becoming a 3-year chronological error. So my argument is that first chronological dislocation was original, that it became a year out because of this problem at Canterbury, which continued up until recent times when you have more reliably dated events. So things like Athelwulf's pilgrimage to Rome, the marriage of Athelwulf's daughter to the Burchard King of Mercia. So very reliably dated. That's when we have the chronology back again. There would have been diplomatic records of that, documentary records, contracts, all sorts of stuff. When Athelwulf went to Rome, we're told he booked a certain amount of land to God, so there would have been written records of that. So that leaves you with the problem of the earlier big chronological dislocation, which I argue was caused by the second revising chronicler, who inserted a big story into the annal, which should have been 757, but ends up as 755 in the dislocated version, which is the story of Cynewulf and Cyneheard. There are other chronological dislocations in the annals, but usually they're quite small and they're corrected very quickly because scribes make mistakes, they're not sure. Latin numerals are very easy to make mistakes with. The difference between a 7 and an 8 is just the stroke of a pen. And if somebody, when they're writing the number 8, was running out of ink when they're doing the last one, it might have been very faint and you couldn't see it. So you just quickly wrote the wrong number. So you get 1 year, 2-year dislocations like that super quickly, but they correct. Often when they're turning a page copying, they make a mistake. They got the number sort of 893 in their head and they write down 893 at the top of the next page, but it should have been 892. The sort of things that we do still, but now we write with computers. It's far more difficult to make these mistakes now, but
Right.
because we're not turning pages usually.
Right.
So yeah, and if you think about the B text of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is quite fascinating. It leaves out almost all of the dates after the 7th century up to its present moment in the 870s. You have to ask, why would you leave out the dates? And it's probably because the copyist of that chronicle, all in one hand, realized there was a problem with chronology, probably in this period we're talking about, and therefore didn't trust the chronology at all and was hoping to return and put the correct years for events, but never did. So I think the omission of years tells you that somebody's already suspicious that something's gone wrong, but didn't know how to fix it. So you have
Right.
this chronicle without years, which is almost a linguistic paradox. Yeah, I hope
It
that
almost feels like, yes, it
sorry.
does. It does. I think when I was reading this, I kind of chuckled that this all seems to revolve around the Cynewulf and Cyneheard
Yeah.
passage, which just seems to be like the chronicle passage. Every time that it's taught in readers in textbooks and stuff like that, the representation of the chronicles is this Cynewulf and Cyneheard passage, and of course that's the one that that this
It's
whole
completely atypical,
dislocation. Yeah. So could
and
you
of
could you
course,
speak a bit
yeah.
about that? Yeah, could you speak
Sure,
about it?
yeah.
Why is it so different? It's so dramatic and lively, I think is the word you use it. Why is that?
Um, Good question. So I think that's when Janet Bately is the one who did all the hard legwork on this. She established that there's the author of that annal is linguistically different from all the annals around it, and that the same author apparently authored the annals of at least the 870s and probably some into the 880s as well. When you do linguistic tests on vocabulary, um, if a word's not used in an annal, it's a bit hard to say who wrote it because some annals don't use the same vocabulary. They describe the same things rather. So, but she established that. And I think you can extend that linguistic test in other ways to other annals, but that's a separate matter. So this is a different author from the one who produced all the annals around it. Different words for dying, different ways of using the verbs in a continuous tense, are the two biggest markers of that. Um, and those verbs are very important in the story of Cynewulf and Cyneheard because it uses lots of different verbs. It's very descriptive of action, as you've said. One of the main things that we are interested in chronology notice is that he attributes to King Cynewulf a reign of 31 years, which is wrong. It's 29 years. And the coincidence between the difference of 2 years and the chronological dislocation of 2 years is significant. It has to be noteworthy. And this later author, who was far more interested, I'll get to talking about the annal in a minute, wasn't as good at chronology as the first one was. He was far more interested in story. It may not even have bothered him that he put the chronology out by a couple of years. Might not have cared because he's more interested in ideology. It seems the ideology of kingship. So, as anybody who's watching this probably knows, in the year 757, not 755 as the annals say, Cynewulf deprived Ceabricht of his kingdom and the West Saxon Witan. The word order, the Witan and the king deprive him of his power. Already that's interesting constitutionally. It's not Cynewulf doing this on his own. He's doing this with the senior councillors of the kingdom. They're agreeing to this action because deposing a king is unlawful. You're not allowed to do it. Um, so first of all, there's this qualification that it was done in almost a parliamentary way. You don't exaggerate that, but it was done with the consent of those ruling the kingdom. And a reason is given. This is very unusual in the annals. It's part of the mark of this author. He likes to give reasons for historical events, terms of cause and effect. And it's for unrichtum datum, for unrighteous deeds or for unlawful deeds, um, which is fascinating. So king deposed. It's agreed by the parliament. Interesting if you look forward to the Glorious Revolution, sort of centuries later, the parliament agrees, king goes, there's a new king, and the old king goes because he was behaving illegally. And then the story descends to the point where he ends up in exile and he's murdered by a swineherd. So this is the deposed Ceabricht. And we're told why that was too. We're not told just, I mean, there's a certain ignominy in killing by somebody who works with pigs, but it's not just that. He's killed by somebody who works with pigs but has more honor than he does, because Ceabricht murders those around him. This swineherd avenged the death of an alderman. So he's given honor and he becomes an honorable person in a different legal system. The sort of the requirement to seek revenge for a murder. And which is sort of all about balance as well. So then the story develops, and Ceabricht's brother, Cyneheard, decides he wants to be king, so he makes a tilt at the throne. And he gets his mates, and they come and they ambush Cynewulf when he's off visiting a woman. We're not sure what the circumstances were. She's a mistress, maybe she's queen.
Yeah, isn't the
Cynewulf,
word weave cuthe kind of
we've
ambiguous?
yes, getting to know a lady, yeah,
Yeah.
whatever that. But he's alone with her in one building. His bodyguard, his retainers are in another one. So he's ambushed in this building. He fights honorably and is killed. There's no imputing of him. It's the weird word Weithkutha. It's very hard to read. Sort of, is it a criticism or not? Um, One of the embedded criticisms is that he leaves no heir. He doesn't have any obvious heir, Cynewulf. So That's just latent in there. Francis Lenehan has written about this. But the others come to help. They're all killed except for one British hostage who's severely wounded. And then the king's supporters arrive at the gates of this tun, which would have been some sort of hill fortification with a palisade around it and a few different buildings in it. And they come to the gates, which are locked against them, and they sort of, there's a bit of negotiation. And I'm going through this so that I can explain what I think is going on. And Cyneheard offers them money and land if they'll support his claim of the throne. And they say no. We would rather die than serve the slayer of our Lord. So this noble virtue is inserted. But it's very strange. They're serving their dead lord. Why would they serve their dead lord? It's very impractical. It seems very lofty. The Victorians really like this loyalty to the dead king. The people well into the 20th century have thought this is a great value, a great virtue. And then there's another battle. Cyneheard is killed, all except for one, the god's son of the alderman, Osric, who is severely wounded. So there's a very significant patterning to events. So there are several questions to ask. So how does an author writing annals in the 880s know in such detail about something which happened in the 750s, 130 years earlier? And people have debated whether there's a poetic source. My analysis of the language suggests probably not. Others have suggested not as well. But there's still a very tight oral structure, and memories can be passed on not just through poetry. People can tell stories without poems. I think we know that. But they have folk tales, as you might imagine. They have very tight structure to them, and this has a very tight structure, this story. Asser, in his Life of Alfred, tells another story which is not mentioned. The king who emerges out of all this conflict in the 780s is King Beorhtric of Wessex, who marries, what's her name? Forgotten her name. That's what happens. The daughter of the Mercian King Offa, who's the great magnate of England at the time, and he tells a story about how she used to poison people at court, and she's very nasty, and finally was driven into exile and died an ignominious death in Pavia in northern Italy. This is not in the chronicle, this story. Don't know why. It was available at the time, but Asser says that King Alfred himself told Asser the story as it had been passed on to him. So there's memory keeping happening at the royal court of certain events. So this story of Cynewulf and Cyneheard is probably a part of that memory keeping at the royal court. What went on. Interesting that involves sort of slightly doubtful behavior in regard to women as well. So the salacious stuff is presumably passed on, but not written down until it gets into the chronicle. So why in the 880s would you want to insert this story into a chronicle in which otherwise it's all about how wonderful King Alfred is? So it deals with difficulty in succession to the kingdom. Who succeeds to a kingdom? One of the words that the author uses right towards the end of that entry is Richtvater, and he traces their rightful or lawful loyal paternal descent back to Cerdic, the founder of Wessex. So there's something about the legitimacy of an heir. Now, in the 880s, Alfred is clearly thinking about what will happen after Alfred. When he's dead, what's going to happen to the kingdom? There's this new political reality which seems to be emerging in his reign of West Saxon dominance, looking towards large swathes of territory under Viking control. And Alfred decides to cut his nephew Athelwald out of his will. Up until this time, the idea that there might be two kings in Wessex or two kings ruling the same kingdom is fine, different parts of it. But Alfred decides to leave the kingdom to his son Edward, the whole thing. When Alfred dies, Athelwald does mount a rebellion and tries to claim part of it or all of it, nearly does so. But this author of this annal is looking forward to a situation like that. Will those who rule the kingdom with, or the Witan, the senior council of the kingdom, the big magnates, the people with the power, who can raise an army for you, will they support Alfred's idea? Because they won't be supporting Alfred because he'll be dead. Will they be supporting his idea of the kingdom through supporting Edward? And that seems to be a part of what's embedded in this annal. It's a different kind of loyalty. It's a very abstract loyalty when you're applying loyalty to the dead. And it's moving beyond this bargaining, which must I mean, it still happens whenever there's an election or whatever. To get elected, you have to do this bargaining, offering money and land. You offer the goodies if you want to be king, and the followers of the dead King Cynewulf at the gates say no. We refuse these goodies that you're offering us because we don't want you to be king because of the way you've done this. It's creating disorder in the kingdom. So I think that sort of ideology is there. The idea that you can depose a king is a bit dangerous to embed in the chronicle, and this is something that's picked up by the author of the Annals of Edward the Elder, who echoes the event, and the author of the Annals of Ethelred, also in his 1014 annal, looks back seemingly to this moment about the deposition of an unrighteous king, because King Ethelred has been sent into exile. So who chooses a king? How does a king become a king? Obviously, the Witan have an important role, but what is their role and what should they be serving? They should be serving order. They should be serving the good of the kingdom, and behaving in a way that at least they can present as lawful, which is moving out of the anarchy and chaos of the earlier Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, where it was just might was right and bad luck to the rest of them. Yeah, so it's
Right.
a new kind of order that emerges in that annal, which does tie it very closely to the Alfredian project, where he's making laws, reforming the church, so trying to make it a stable, coherent, law-abiding kingdom. Yeah.
I think one of the most striking lines from that entry is when the men are outside the gates,
Yeah.
and the I think that yeah, again the offer of land and gold is given to them, and he also says your relatives are here. I have your kinsmen up here on the wall with me, and they're not going to come down. They're going to fight with me here. And the response is no relative could be dearer to us than our dead king. I
Yeah.
think that that's exactly what you're saying, that kind of
Yeah.
loyalty to the king even after his death.
And transcending those family bonds, which I mean, you see in the poem Beowulf what anarchy they cause, those bonds, and these sort of family alliances around powerful war leaders will not produce a stable kingdom. So Alfred's vision of the kingdom is embedded in this story in subtle ways, which is makes it very literary. It's not just sort of spelled out in a clear way. You have to reflect on this story, which is not normally how you read a chronicle. Chronicles, I mean, I don't even know how you read a chronicle. It moves from being a reference book for dates to being a history at that moment. It's a very different style of writing, and expects to be read. And I think we can see that it is read even a century later to understand what's going on in the evolution of the what becomes the English Constitution. Yeah.
So you mentioned the kind of poetic borrowing hypothesis, and it's specifically in your 2014 article, you talk about how Henry Sweet suggested in 1879 that the common stock annals draw from poetic material as sources. How much should we believe that?
I think it's 2024, not 2014, because I
Oh, I said
remember it.
2014.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
meant 2024.
It
Yeah, sorry,
was just
sorry.
last year. Yeah. I think Sweet is right. The question is not so much whether, but how,
Mhm.
which comes to do with the sources that the first maker of the Chronicle was using. I don't. There's not a lot of evidence that poetic sources were used directly, except in one case, which I think is the Annal 837, where Nick Sparks has pointed out in the A version, it's very alliterative, and in the subsequent copyings, that alliterative character is erased by changing vocabulary, and it seems to be a poem that's being cited there. But otherwise, I mean, how do you, yeah, how far back can you go to remember things? So the Chronicle claims to be reporting events from the 6th century. The 6th century in Wessex was going back to describing these chaotic kingdoms and their loyalties. There was no church. The Anglo-Saxons don't have the technology of writing. The British do, who they're living with, but so there's a possibility of records there, but they're not the records that get into the Chronicle. They're not coming from Welsh or British sources. So how are these events remembered? One of the interesting connections probably is the major reform tied to the Synod of Whitby in 664 with the uniform date of Easter, which would have involved the production and copying and importation of lots of manuscripts that told you how to calculate Easter, which would have given you these Easter tables with lists of years and when Easter would be in any given year. And we know from in Ireland and other places, in Germany, that Easter tables would often attract analytic sort of record for that. In this year, this happened. So these Easter tables, when imported, wouldn't have just started in 664. They'd have been in the great cycles of Easter, which is sort of 91 years. And some of them would have gone back, maybe to the beginning of the 6th, maybe into the 5th century. And somebody might have had the impulse at the time to start taking events which were existing only in memory and putting them into these Easter tables, which have a 19-year cycle within a much broader cycle. And a couple of the annals from the late, I can't remember the exact years, but a couple of people have talked about this. Sarah Foot's talked about it. They're 19 years apart, and they seem to be describing the same event. And this is probably tied to the 19-year cycle of the Easter tables as a locus of memory, but of recording memory of events that till then had probably only existed in oral memory, which, as we've seen with the story of Cynewulf and Cyneheard, is entirely plausible. That an event from the 750s is recorded in the 880s, maybe not completely accurately. I mean, the date's wrong for a start, but it's highly structured, like a folk tale. And so the plausibility of recording in the 660s or around the year 700, whatever, something that happened 130 years earlier is as I say, it's quite plausible. There'll be some mistakes. There'll be some slight slippage of years. They're not quite sure when something happened. But that will become the official event once it gets into that chronology. And those sources, folktale, probably, poetry, well, not folktale, but folktale style stories, and probably poetry as well. Some of the syntax in these early annals is not standard syntax. It seems to be pointing to the way things are expressed in poetry. Some poetic vocabulary as well just gets in there. There's a fair bit of poetic vocabulary in the Cynewulf and Cyneheard story too, which I think is that overlap between oral storytelling. John Niles has written a lot about oral storytelling, and poetry, which would have been closely related forms, but not exactly the same thing. So yeah, I think Swede is right, and I think you can show that in some places, yeah, this is probably what's going on here, but in others, not so easily demonstrable. But once you've caught the rabbit, that's it. It's there.
Right. And then we have like explicit poems, which when I first found out about these, at first learning about the Chronicle, they were kind of startling. I had actually known about the Battle of Brunanburg, for example, and I didn't realize that it was a Chronicle like entry until maybe a year after I first read it. And so to kind of discover that was kind of odd. But you point out that these poems seem to follow a sort of trend. They're in sort of like a series of poetry concerning the kings of England. Can we learn anything from the evolution in their tone about sort of medieval English identity?
Um, Identity, I think so, and attitudes to kingship, I think, shift. And I mean, you don't want to overgeneralize, because whenever you're dealing with a poem, you're dealing with one person who made the poem, and so you've got their attitude. So if somebody then copies that into the Chronicle, you've got two people. If somebody then copies that poem, you start to get a community of people who are sharing the opinion. If when you look at that, but so the Battle of Brunanburg is clearly, I mean, it's imperialistic in tone. There's no doubt about it, and it's glorifying the great victory of Athelstan and his brother Edmund over the Vikings, the Dublin Vikings under Anlaf, and the Scots under Constantine. This is a great victory, and the poem was probably written close. I mean, this is my theory. Other people disagree, because it's very hard to it was tell when these things happen. It was probably written as a standalone poem praising Athelstan, makes its way into the Chronicle. The standalone poem, if you imagine that soon after the event, maybe it's some victory celebration or whatever, is praising the king and his brother for their great victory. By the 940s, 950s, when it's being copied into the Chronicle, the importance of that event is much clearer. It's not just a great victory, it is a moment of imperial expansion. because though the Scots fight back in the 940s and the Vikings fight back in the 940s, by the end of the 940s, the remit of the English kings runs in the north. That's it. And the Scottish kings make this vague submission, meaning they won't cause trouble, basically. They do cause trouble, but they try not to. But there's a recognition of the importance of the English king on the island of Britain. The Welsh kings submit as well. This famous events at Chester and rowing boats and all that sort of thing. So the retrospect on that poem, which is slightly imperialistic, but it's more celebration of the event. But when it gets copied in the Chronicle, it takes on a different perspective, I think. There's an understanding that this was very pivotal, this moment, which is not so embedded in the poem itself, that it's a pivotal political moment. They might have thought that it would continue, but whoever wrote the poem, I think, doesn't know about the 940s when there was this great fight back. And so the poem of the Battle of the Five Boroughs is about Edmund sort of taking the Midlands back from the Vikings, but he's very important in that contest. So the next poems we get, apart from those two, Brunanburh and the Five Boroughs, which are great celebratory poems about this great military expansion and this conquest of territory, the defeat of enemies, rival powers, is in the 970s, celebrating first the coronation of King Edgar, which is a great celebration poem. And he's almost Christ-like. He was not Christ-like in his life. He lived the life of a loose king, you'd have to say, which causes problems after he dies because there are different claimants to the throne from different mothers. But he's very much this king being anointed in a sort of with millennial expectation. It talks about the millennium coming. There's some echoes of what's going on with the Ottonians in Germany. We now have this great emperor king. And then he dies suddenly a couple of years later. And the author of that poem is not that, it doesn't get into praising. I mean, even the author of the poem about the coronation of it doesn't praise the king too much. It's very conventional, the praise of the king. There's no sort of, and he defeated the Scots and the Vikings stuff, and he didn't conquer any territory. It's just he's sitting there amongst the churchmen being glorious. And then this poem about the death of Edgar in 975, just the first part of the poem talks about, he died. The great ring giver died on this, just then he died this year. And then describes a whole lot of trouble that happened afterwards. And portents in the sky, and God punished the people with famine, and great men were banished from the kingdom. The great men who were banished from the kingdom are described in far more detail, and their greatness is described in more detail than the king's, which must make you a little bit suspicious about the attitude to the king. And talks about the new king, Edward, the martyr. He's not the martyr yet. When the poem is made, he's not yet dead. But it's critical of him. And those who it's critical of those who put him on the throne. It calls him an unwaxen child. An immature child becomes the king. That's hardly words of praise, you'd have to say. And so it's more critical reflection on kingship and what goes wrong if you make the wrong call on who's going to be king. Going back to the Witan and the king deciding what goes on in the kingdom. And then, so that's a very ambivalent poem, I'd say, about Edgar, ambivalent about Edward. A couple of years afterwards, 3 years, 4 years afterwards, we're not quite sure exactly when, Edward is murdered, which plunges the kingdom into a decades-long identity crisis. Can you murder a king? There's no suggestion of Unrichtum Datum. He's still a child. He's what's his name? Birkforth of Ramsey reports in his Life of St. Oswald that he was actually a very difficult child. He was very abusive to those around him. He used to beat them and physically and verbally abuse them. He says nobody even more than those close to him. So we understand why he's murdered, because the kingdom descends into chaos and he's really difficult, but that still doesn't justify murdering a king. And so then there's this cult emerges of him as a martyr. How he's a martyr, it's a bit difficult to say. He was dead. But the cult of the martyr becomes a way of critiquing the reign of Athelred that comes after. And certainly for the first few decades of Athelred's reign, the shadow of this murder is there. But that's not in the poem. So this critique is not, it's a critique of the transition. It's a moment of the transition. The next major poem we get in the chronicle, it's when the poetic form is becoming a bit free, is on the murder of Alfred, who was one of Ethelred's sons, in fact. And brother of Edward the Confessor, who comes to England during the chaos that followed Canute's death, when two of Canute's sons are rivals. And Alfred had picked his moment very badly. He arrives with a large armed force on the south coast of England, and he does seem to be making a tilt for the throne. It's not quite reported that way historically, but something goes on. It's very difficult to get through the records to exactly what went on. His mother might have been involved in his betrayal. This Alfie Emma. Godwin was probably involved, who is the father of the man who becomes Harold, King of England. And so he's murdered. Well, he's not murdered. He's the death of Edward. A lot of his followers are murdered. He's blinded and taken to the monastery at Ely, where he dies. So by blinding him, I mean, that's one of the things that suggests he's making a tilt at the throne, because he's blind and he can't be king. You can't be king if you're blind. Not possible. So that rules him out. But there's this poem about this, which must have been written. The material around it tells us it's written in the 1040s. So Edward the Confessor is on the throne. But it's one of those crimes that cries out to heaven for revenge, like the murder of Edward the Martyr. There's no justice for this. There's no revenge. The powerful men of the kingdom do these things, and the kings can't stop them, which is a pretty big crisis, an extended crisis in the kingdom. The Annals of Ethelred talk about the king almost being powerless because of the bad advice, the unrad that he receives. That author of the Annals of Ethelred, which I think is Archbishop Wulfstan of York, also writes two poetic sections which get embedded into the 10th century annals. So we talk about them as poems as well. The first one is praising Edgar, but also critical of Edgar, that he imported too many foreign customs. So he doesn't observe our ways, he observes the ways of foreigners, whatever they are, unspecified. So that's another poem that criticizes a king. And then there's a short poetic piece on the death of Edward the Martyr, which does praise him as a martyr. Those who were his slayers fell down and had to worship his bones. So his Bana worship his Bana. There's a wordplay in Old English. And then after the poem about the death of Alfred, the next poem, extended poem, is about Harold and Edward the Confessor. So it's about Edward the Confessor, apparently written during the reign of Harold. It praises Edward, wonderful king, great guy, all these wonderful things. But it seems to be setting up Harold as his successor. I talk about this in the book. It never talks about Edward the Confessor as being an atheling, which is one of the things that qualifies you to be king of England. You're a son of royalty, son of the king, son or grandson perhaps, but certainly not a descendant of Cerdic, the founder of Wessex. But he talks about his athel qualities. So he was athelum in everything he did, and then it talks about how Harold was athel as well. So not atheling, but athel. And this somehow, I think the whole poem about the death of Edward the Confessor is in fact about legitimizing Harold's succession. It talks about him choosing Harold. So you come back to this constitutional question: who chooses the king? And we all know that William the Conqueror himself thought that there was a deal that he would be king, and he comes later. But this is a different understanding of kingship that emerges in the poems. The constitutional stuff is very interesting, the way it's embedded, that the king chooses his successor, and through assent, the great men of the kingdom choose, which is not surprising. The House of Godwin was basically running England, so their first son gets to become king. That didn't work out. The Battle of Hastings showed that William's claim was, it could be proved on the field of battle under the Pope's banner, so therefore God chooses William. The English nobility do not choose William. They resist William on the whole, but finally submit to him. And then the next poetic piece we get is this one that I've mentioned already, which is about William, on the death of William, where he's not particularly praised. The author of the poem says, and I hope he didn't go to hell, in a sort of a faint way, thinking maybe somebody who lived like that and behaved like that probably did. And the next one is found in the D Chronicle. Is a little poetic passage about Margaret of Scotland, which is the last sort of full and obvious. It's not classical Old English verse, but it's poetic in its style and vocabulary. And It's embedded with prose, like the death of Alfred is. So it seems to be looking back. They're always looking back. And Margaret is praised as sort of great virtue, but it's also mentioned that she is a descendant of the royal house of Wessex. And this poetic piece, she marries Malcolm of Scotland. So why would there be this interest in her royal descent? Also traces her descent from the Roman Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, in a vague way, because it wasn't quite certain how that happened. But this sort of annal must be written after her marriage, after the marriage of her daughter, Edith Emma, to Henry I, because it's returning the English royal bloodline to or uniting it with the Norman conquerors. And so these poems reflect on kingship. They reflect on the legitimacy of kingship, what makes you a legitimate king, the extent of your kingship, and also the problems with that. So Alfred, the Atheling Alfred who's murdered, has a much stronger claim in traditional terms to the throne than either of Canute's sons, Harther Canute or Harold Harefoot, but he can't establish it on the field of battle, so that's it. And yeah, there's continuing reflection, particularly in these poetic sections, about royal legitimacy, royal power, royal succession, and overall gives you a sense of ambivalence about how that might happen. Um,
Yeah, I was pretty shocked to see that there is a poem about William the Conqueror. It's never taught. I guess just because it's pretty late at that point, so it
yes,
doesn't really fall into the textbook definition
no,
of
and
Old English.
it's not classical verse. It doesn't follow the
Hmm.
Seaver's rules, basically. In the earliest edition of the Chronicle, or not the earliest, but in the very important edition of the Chronicle made by Plummer in the 1890s, when Seaver's theories hadn't caught on in England, maybe a bit resisted, I don't know. He formats as verse a lot of this stuff that um, Crap and Dobby in their Anglo-Saxon poetic records don't point out as verse. They say it's not verse because it doesn't follow the strict metrical criteria. Um, Now we would be more open to talking about it as non-classical verse. Yeah. I mean, obviously poetic form evolves. Got to go with it. Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Okay. Pivoting to your work on King Alfred, you remark in the preface to your 2017 book that most people these days don't know much about him. In my experience, most people don't know who he is at all. So let's say you're in an elevator or let's say a bus ride, and you have 5 minutes to explain to someone who King Alfred is. Where do you think you begin?
I'll give you some anecdotes first. Um,
Okay, sure.
so just departing into Shakespeare, this confusion of Alfred. Alfred is often confused with Arthur. That's one of the things that happens. And a very senior academic at my university once asked me how my work on King Arthur was going. And I mean, he's a historian. He should have been ashamed of himself. And I said, well, no, I actually work on King Alfred. So I'm not blaming. So the popular culture reflects other problems. But there's that great passage in Henry V where Mistress Quickly talks about Falstaff having died and saying he's not in hell, but he's gone to Arthur's bosom. And so Abraham comes into the mix as well, sort of with this confusion of names. So she confuses Abraham and Arthur, and there's something about the foundation of England and mythology that Arthur is important, and everybody knows about King Arthur, and which suggests that and I'll get back to who is Alfred in a minute, that the myth makers post conquest who brought in this whole legend of Brutus and the founding of Britain, and sort of have Arthur there as an important figure resisting the Anglo-Saxons. Their mythologizing worked better than the English mythologizers, who were, of course, defeated at the Battle of Hastings in many ways, to make Alfred the great founder of England. So it's either Arthur is the founder of Britain or Alfred is the founder of England. And in the 19th century, they both become important. Alfred is important constitutionally in all sorts of ways as an English figure, and Arthur as some sort of British figure, both of whom get a bad name sort of as we look back at sort of British imperialism of the period and their role, not their own personal role, but their own role in the mythologizing around sort of British, English cultural superiority, if not racial as well. So who is Alfred? when you're saying who is Alfred, it's probably better that people don't know who he is, because it means that all of that stuff, all of that baggage is gone. All of the imperialist myth making is now removed. So we can start with the new Alfred. So who is Alfred? Um, Alfred was the fifth son of a king of Wessex, which was a small kingdom in England in the 9th century. And in the course of his life, England was invaded by the Vikings. People have heard of the Vikings. And the Vikings were so successful in their invasion that England, which was made up of 4 different kingdoms at the time, was almost completely overrun. Alfred was an important figure in making sure that they didn't overrun all of England and that England didn't become basically a Danish country. England, if they had succeeded, would be much more be speaking a language not exactly like Danish, but something like Danish. If you look at what happened in Norway with sort of linguistically, so Norwegian and Danish quite close, English and Danish would have been quite close. Alfred is the figure who stopped that because having almost been defeated by the Vikings, he pushed back, re-established his English kingdom, thought about what it meant to be king rather than just a war leader, set up the basis of sort of a reform of the church, a reform of law, a reform of the way things were done, set up defenses. He really thought about what it meant to be king. And that is the idea that caught on. And when people look back at Alfred before the 19th century, they particularly focused on his role in setting up England that would become the England that we know today as a country. That would be my 5 minutes. Because you've got
Nice,
the
very
Vikings,
nice.
people know. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, speaking to his sort of at least popularity among some people, I know several of my English viewers will be familiar with the story of him burning the cakes.
Mm.
I was never taught that story, but when you Google it, you do
I was.
find
Yeah, yeah.
all these sort of blogs and stuff. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Did he do it? Did he burn the cakes?
I don't know. Yeah, this sort of early version of MasterChef where he gets eliminated very early on. Bad. I think probably not. I don't think he burnt the cakes, but it's very interesting that there was a story in popular culture um, circulating about Alfred in the late 10th century when this story seems to be first documentable. It's a complicated relationship between saints' lives of or legends of St. Cuthbert and St. Neot. But I won't go into the detail around that. But it's in the life of St. Neot, which may be a 12th century composition, that we have this story of Alfred burning the cakes. The moment Alfred burned his cakes is with this Viking attack, this sudden Viking attack, 6th of January, 878. The Vikings who have agreed peace with the king, they attack when everybody's just finishing off their Christmas festivities. So it's the 12th night. And they almost overrun the kingdom. In fact, they overrun the kingdom, and Alfred has to go into hiding. The Chronicle reports, and Asser agrees, that many people went overseas, as refugees down to France, a sort of paradoxical inversion of what's happening now. And so Alfred goes into the Somerset levels, and this is where this mythological moment emerges of sort of the hidden Alfred who's been reduced from kingship to being an exile, a refugee within his own kingdom. And he's all alone in the story. In the historical records, he's never all alone. We're told he's with a small troop of followers, a band who's big enough to build a fortification for him on the Isle of Athelney. In the life of St. Cuthbert, I think it's 3 years he spends in this wandering exile in the Somerset levels. Historically, no, it was a few months. He retakes the kingdom by sort of late May, June. So roughly 6 months, but it becomes 3 years, and St. Neots doesn't report how long. So that's the context, the moment of Alfred's actual historical life when these sorts of stories emerge. Now, it's the fact that it's in the life of St. Neot is significant. So St. Neot, um, this legend, he appears to Alfred before Alfred loses his kingdom, and he says, "You've been a bad king. You've broken the laws. You're going to be punished you're going to lose your kingdom. And then, if in your hour of worst need you remember and pray to me, you'll get it back." And so Alfred doesn't pay any attention to this, loses his kingdom. This is not the historical Alfred, I don't think. So already the framing of it tells us we're not dealing with the same person. So off he goes into the marshes, into the levels, and all alone, hungry. and he comes to this cottage, and the cottage is very interestingly, it's a swineherd and his wife. Now we've heard about a swineherd already. There's a swineherd in the story of Cynewulf and Cyneheard. So swineherd's stock figure in the story of an exiled king. Great. So stock figures also problematic, and he's set to look after the cakes, which meditatively in many sort of Victorian paintings, he's just looking up in the sky and thinking about the return of his kingdom, and he forgets, he doesn't pay attention. She comes and she scolds him for burning the cakes. Now, there's so many different ways of reading that. It's funny. It's actually funny that the king is scolded by the swineherd's wife. And but there's also the king thinking about returning to his kingdom. And so the cakes become unimportant. They become symbolic in certain ways. But did it happen? Probably not. Was Alfred important enough in the popular imagination? Now, the popular imagination, imagine having access to that in the 10th century in England. He's important enough in historical memory amongst the common people that there are legends about him. This is extraordinary. So the importance is not that whether or not he burnt the cakes, but that people who weren't of the royal family and chronicle writers and official keepers of memory had their own memories of Alfred, where they reduced him down to a popular figure who encountered the normal people of his kingdom. And that's very interesting, I think. So did he burn his cakes? Probably not. But that's really not the important thing. The important thing is that he entered popular memory.
Right. And he's sort of used as this moralizing now figure in almost as if like it's a fairy tale or a kid's story where his reaction to being scolded is to be like, wow, this is humility from God. I should just accept this and take it and move on with my life as, this is my punishment from God. He doesn't
And
scold
it's
her.
in
He
a
doesn't.
saint's life.
Yeah.
It's in a
Yeah.
saint's life, and this is what St. Neot, who's a very important saint, not really, but becomes one, is teaching him. He's teaching him humility, and so at this nadir of his life, he achieves what St. Neot has sent him into exile to do, which is that he can come back and be a humble man, and then he will get his kingdom. I mean, a part of the discussion around Alfred is whether or not he should be canonized as a saint. The last serious effort was, I think, Henry VI assembled a documentary case to send to Rome in the late 15th century for the canonization of Alfred. The Reformation got in the way, and so it never happened. But yeah, so it's Alfred, his own sort of saintly character is hinted at there. I think the story of St. Neot was in that dossier. The dossier has been published in modern times by Ronald Knox, who edited it. You might have heard of Ronald Knox, Monsignor Knox, very important 20th century Catholic figure. But yeah, so Alfred wasn't canonized, but that's the context within which we find the cakes. And so it tells us multiple things about him. Yeah.
Did he learn Latin instantaneously with divine intervention?
There's another miracle. Yeah. It's very difficult to know what Asa is talking about for a start. Um, and because of the vocabulary he uses. Is he saying that he suddenly got Latin or that he suddenly learnt Latin? I I would lean much more to the former, that he sort of got it. He's not getting it in the way a scholar does. He's not doing that. We're told by Asa that he was very devout, and I don't think there's any reason to doubt that. Modern readers often prefer to overlook the fact that a medieval king might have been devout. Um, though the chroniclers, that second chronicler certainly embeds the idea of divine destiny, as does Asa. So the idea of him being divinely chosen is available at court, at Alfred's court. So the idea that he's devout shouldn't surprise anybody. I forget where we were going with that question. What was it about?
About his learning of instantaneous Latin.
That's right. Yeah. So if he's devout, he would be attending to the hours and to the mass and to the liturgy. Um, so which are conducted in Latin, as we know. He would have had a prayer book, maybe a glossed psalter, something like that. We have these psalters which are in Latin, which are glossed in Old English. So Alfred would have been exposed to and in many ways immersed in Latin. Would he have been able to read Augustine's City of God? Probably not. Would he ever have been able to read that? Probably not. Would there have been a moment when somebody was sitting down translating stuff for him that he actually understood what was happening in Latin as they brought it into English? I think so. That he could see Latin grammar, that he could see the vocabulary and that he could get it. I think that's what's going on. Did he then sit down and translate stuff himself? Probably not. Miraculous stories, I mean, if this is a miraculous story, should be treated with some degree of skepticism when the object of the focus of the story is a highly venerated king. Um, and Asser is writing for the Welsh kings as well. And he's trying to portray, who just recently submitted to Alfred as their overlord, their overking. He's the high king. They're the secondary kings. And he's trying to convince them that this is not humiliating, I think, that Alfred is not like all previous English kings who had encountered, he was just sort of a violent thug. This man is educated. This man is erudite. This man knows how to run a kingdom. It's okay. Yeah, I think that's what he's saying.
At this point, I'm completely shrouded in darkness, for which I apologize. This is the American
Something
East
happened.
Coast
Yeah.
night. One more question for you before we go. If you could travel back in time, sit yourself right in front of Alfred, and then, of course, the TARDIS is here translating what you say into perfect West Saxon as well. What would you ask him if you get one question?
Well, maybe I could take you with me, and you could interpret because I see you speak Old English.
Oh. Nei, maar iets Swede wel dan, iets willen van die aan.
See, you could do it. So, what I would ask him, there's 1,000 questions that I think people would like to ask him. Sort of, did he translate anything, and what this, what that. I would like to ask him what sort of depends which Alfred is it the adult Alfred I'm talking to or younger Alfred?
For
Because when you're
sure. Let's
traveling
say the full king in his prime.
880s Alfred, yeah, in charge, yeah. I would ask him what memories does he have of? There's two questions I ask, but I'll ask you choose. You can choose which one I might. What were his memories of his time traveling to Rome? What were his impressions of the rest of the world? There's something that's completely hidden from us. We can speculate, did he write this, did he write that? But we have evidence that gives us a way of talking about that. But this is something we know nothing about. What was it like visiting Old St. Peter's, the church built by Constantine? What did he do there? Did he pick up Italian, which would have made it easy to learn Italian in the 9th century? Learning Latin on that basis wouldn't have been that difficult. What was it like visiting the Carolingian court? All that sort of stuff. I would like to ask him. The other question, which I might ask him, is could he show me the book of poetry that his mother gave him?
That is to
Which
see what we have lost, or
I presume he still has it. So could you just show me that book? And if he can't, could you recite to me, because you memorized it, could you recite to me what it was?
yeah, that's a good point. We could double the size of our Old English poetic corpus.
Or not? We might discover that, in fact, there's only a few poems in there that we don't know already. We
Yeah,
don't
that would
know.
be really something.
That I'd probably go with the second one, but I'm interested in the first. But the second one would be, I mean, yeah. But when you got back in the TARDIS and said, "Oh, Alfred told me all this poetry," and here it is, they'd say, "No, you probably just made that up."
Or it would dissolve or something like that.
That's
It's
right.
not
The
allowed.
memory would not be the same. My memory wouldn't be as good as his because I'm living in the 21st century when our memories fail us very quickly. Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, this has been very brilliant. Thank you very much for coming on, and I hope the viewers have found this as educational and enjoyable as I have. Until next time, though, this was Daniel Anlezark. Farathie Yasunde.